Sign it, Meredith. I don't have time for this. That was what my husband said to me. Not on a random Tuesday. Not after a quiet argument about money or chores. He said it 4 days after we lowered my father into the ground at Riverside Memorial, while the sympathy cards were still sitting unopened on the kitchen counter, and my eyes were still swollen from crying. He slid the envelope across the dining table like he was passing me a utility bill. I stared at it for a moment. My hands were still. I think some part of me already knew what was inside because my body went cold before my brain caught up. Divorce papers. I looked up at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his phone. "What is this?" I said. It wasn't even a question. My voice came out flat, almost clinical. "You know what it is." He finally put the phone down. "We've been done for a long time, Meredith. You know that." I did not know that. What I knew was that we had been married for 6 years. What I knew was that 2 weeks before my father was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, my husband and I had booked a trip to Colorado for our anniversary. We never took it. Dad got sick, and then things moved fast the way cancer does when it's already everywhere, and then there was no more trip, and no more Colorado, and no more anything except hospitals and waiting rooms, and the particular silence that fills a house when someone inside it is dying. What I did not know, what I found out standing in my father's kitchen the night of his memorial, when my sister-in-law, my husband's younger sister, touched my arm and said in the soft, careful voice, "Meredith, I think you should know something," was that my husband had been sleeping with my stepsister for at least 8 months. My stepsister. My father had married her mother when I was 19. We were never close in the way some blended families manage to be. There was always a careful politeness between us, the kind that exists in the space where warmth never fully took root. But she had come to the funeral. She had hugged me. She had stood at my father's grave in a black coat with a small silver pin on the lapel that I remember thinking was a strange choice for a funeral. I had no idea. When my sister-in-law told me, the sound in the room went strange. I could see her mouth moving, but it took several seconds for the words to reach me. She had found text messages on her brother's phone 3 weeks earlier, when he'd left it on her kitchen counter during a family dinner. She had agonized over whether to say anything. She waited until after the funeral because she didn't want to add to my pain. And then she looked at me with these sad, steady eyes and said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I just didn't know how." That was Thursday night. By Sunday, he was handing me divorce papers at the dining table we bought together at a flea market in Tucson 6 years ago and refinished ourselves over a long weekend. I looked at the papers, I looked at him, and I thought about my father, who had spent his last coherent weeks asking me if I was happy, the way fathers do when they sense something is wrong, but don't know how to name it. I had told him yes every time. I believed it. I picked up the pen. I signed my name. My husband took the envelope without a word and left. My father was a practical man. He grew up in rural Ohio, the youngest of 4, and he put himself through community college working nights at a sheet metal plant. He never talked about money the way some people do, with either shame or pride. He just handled it quietly and carefully for his entire life. When he moved to Phoenix in his 40s for work, he built something real, not flashy. A residential property management company, 16 units when he started, 43 by the time he retired. He had a small office on the east side of the city, a paralegal named Gus who'd worked for him for 11 years, and a filing system that he maintained by hand because he didn't trust software to organize what mattered. He remarried when I was 19. My stepmother was a kind woman, softer than my father in the ways that balanced him out. She passed away from a stroke when I was 26. Her daughter, my stepsister, inherited a modest amount and moved to Scottsdale. She and I exchanged texts at Christmas and birthdays. Polite, distant. What I didn't know, until the weeks after the funeral, was that my father had known something was wrong in my marriage before I did. He hadn't said it directly, that wasn't his way. But he had done something about it, quietly, in the way he did everything. I found out 6 weeks after I signed those papers, When my attorney called me on a Wednesday morning while I was eating cereal in my apartment, I had moved out of the house by then, into a small rental near the university, and told me that the formal reading of my father's estate was scheduled for the following Friday. I asked if there was anything I needed to prepare. She paused for a moment and then said, "Just come." My stepsister and my husband, my ex-husband by then technically since he had moved the paperwork through faster than I thought possible, were not invited to the reading. I remember being faintly surprised by that because my father had always tried to include people, had always tried to be fair, but my attorney said the estate was straightforward and that only primary beneficiaries needed to attend. I thought nothing of it. In the weeks between the funeral and the reading, I watched from a distance. My ex-husband and my stepsister made no attempt to be discreet. Within 2 weeks of my father's death, they were photographed together at a rooftop bar downtown by someone who knew me, and the photo made its way to me through a chain of 3 people. He had his arm around her. She was laughing at something. My father had been dead for 11 days. A mutual friend told me, without being asked, that my ex had started telling people they had been in love for a long time and that our marriage had run its course. He said it casually, the way people say things when they've already rehearsed the narrative and decided which version of events they're comfortable with. My stepsister called me once about 3 weeks after the funeral. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was 3 minutes long and I listened to it twice. She said things like, "I know this isn't what you want to hear. And we can't always choose who we love. And I hope someday we can talk about this." Her voice was careful and controlled in a way that told me the call had been thought through in advance. I didn't call back. What I focused on instead was small things. Getting up in the morning, making coffee, going to work. I was a licensed occupational therapist at a pediatric clinic, and there was something that helped me about being around kids who needed real help with real physical things. Problems you could actually measure and address. It got me out of my head. My best friend took me out for pizza 3 Fridays in a row and let me talk and never once said anything that started with, "at least." That was more help than she probably knew. And I waited, without knowing exactly what I was waiting for the Friday of the reading. The attorney's office was in a low-rise building off Camelback Road, the kind with dark glass and too much air conditioning. I got there early and sat in the waiting room with a cup of bad coffee and a 6-month-old magazine I didn't actually read. My attorney came out to get me herself. She was a small woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of directness I had always appreciated in her, even when I was only using her for the relatively simple work of reviewing my rental lease after the separation. She'd also, I would learn that day, been my father's attorney for 9 years. "There's a lot here," she said, once we were seated and she had the folder open on the desk between us. "Your father was thorough." That was the word that cracked me a little, hearing it applied to him. Thorough. It was exactly right. The estate had 2 main components. The first was the property management company, which he had restructured 14 months earlier, before he was even diagnosed, by creating a family LLC and designating me as the sole managing member. Everything flowed through that structure. The properties, the operating accounts, the reserves. My name was the only name on it. The second was a separate personal account he had opened at a credit union in Tempe, different from his primary bank, which had been funded gradually over the last several years. The balance was just under $210,000. He had also made me the sole beneficiary on all 3 of his life insurance policies, which he had quietly updated 8 months before his death. I sat there trying to absorb this. "He changed the beneficiaries 8 months ago," I said. "Yes," she said. "That was before he was diagnosed." "By about 5 months, yes." I looked at the folder. I looked at the ceiling. I thought about my father asking me if I was happy, over and over in those last weeks, and me saying, "Yes, I'm fine, Dad, I'm fine." I thought about the way he'd looked at my husband at Thanksgiving the year before last. Not unfriendly, but watchful, careful. The way he looked at things he was still evaluating. He had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. He had been protecting me before I knew I needed to be protected. "There's one more thing," my attorney said. She slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My name was on it in my father's handwriting. He left this with my office 8 months ago. He said to give it to you at the reading, not before. I held it for a moment. It was light. I thought I would cry, but I didn't, not then. I opened it carefully. It was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. His handwriting, small and even, filling about half the page. Meredith, I don't know exactly what will have happened by the time you read this. Maybe everything is fine and you're rolling your eyes at your old, overly cautious father. I hope that's the case. But I've noticed some things this past year that worry me. I'm not going to write them all down because I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I don't want this letter sitting somewhere making you doubt something that doesn't need to be doubted. What I will say is that I've always trusted your judgment more than you trusted yourself, and I've always believed the people in your life should earn their place there. I've made sure you'll be okay no matter what. The rest is yours to figure out, and you will. Take care of the roses in the back. You're the only one who ever remembered to water them. Love, Dad. The roses were a thing between us. He had a small backyard garden he planted when he first bought the house in Phoenix, and he could grow anything except roses, which he kept trying and kept losing to the heat or the aphids or what he called general stubbornness. I had managed to keep one climbing variety alive for 2 seasons once when I was house-sitting, and he had never let me forget it. I cried in the car outside the attorney's office for about 20 minutes. Then I went home and called my best friend and read her the letter on the phone. She was quiet for a moment. He knew, she said. He knew something, I said. That's the same thing, she said. My ex-husband found out about the estate through the probate process, which is public record. I was told later by a family friend that his initial reaction had been something close to disbelief. He had, apparently, assumed that because my father had never formally excluded him from anything, no dramatic conversations, no visible tension, no confrontations, that he would benefit in some way from the estate. He had, apparently, mentioned this to my stepsister on more than one occasion. He was wrong. There was nothing for him, not a piece of furniture, not a keepsake, not a line in the document. My father had been too methodical for that. Everything had been moved into structures that had nothing to do with the son-in-law, and the restructuring had happened well before any of this, well before the diagnosis. In that quiet, careful way my father did things when he had made up his mind about something. My ex called me once. I picked up, which I'm still not entirely sure was the right decision. He said things I won't repeat in detail, but the overall shape of it was that he felt he had been treated unfairly, that my father had manipulated the situation, that what had happened between him and my stepsister was separate from anything financial and shouldn't be weaponized. I listened until he stopped. Then I said, my father planned this before he was diagnosed, before he knew he was dying. He didn't do it to punish you. He did it because he was looking out for me. There was a silence. That's all I have to say, I said, and I hung up. The property management company took work to learn. I had never run a business. I knew how to manage a caseload and write clinical notes and work with insurance billing. I did not know how to read a commercial lease or manage a maintenance reserve account or handle a code violation notice from the city. But Gus, my father's paralegal, he stayed on. He was 61 and had been doing this specific work for 11 years and knew where everything was, and in those first months he walked me through things with the patience of someone who had clearly been asked to do so, who had, I realized, eventually, been prepared for this. My father had talked to him, had told him sometime in those final months that I might be taking over and that she'll need time to find her footing and please be patient with her. Gus told me this over lunch about 3 months in, matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, while eating a carnitas burrito and looking out the window. He talked about you a lot, Gus said. He was proud of you. I looked at my sandwich and nodded because I didn't trust my voice right then. My stepsister reached out again about 4 months after the reading. Not a call this time, a long email that I read once and then moved to a folder I didn't open again for 6 months. The overall argument of it was that whatever had happened between her and my ex was real, and that she hoped I could find compassion and that she believed family is still family. I didn't respond. I thought about it. I thought about whether silence was the right thing or whether there was something I needed to say. And I kept coming back to my father's letter, to the line about people earning their place. There was nothing she could say that would make what happened in those weeks after his death into something I could absorb without losing something important about myself in the process. Some doors close, and that's just what they do. My ex and my stepsister, I heard eventually through people who knew people, moved in together about 5 months after the divorce was finalized. I also heard about 8 months after that things were not going well. The specific details made their way to me the way things do in a city that's big but not that big, and I noted them without satisfaction, or at least without the kind I'd been afraid I would feel. It just seemed by then like information about people I no longer knew. The company, by the time the first full year was done, was running better than it had in the final years of my father's active management, partly because I'd implemented a software system that Gus had been suggesting for 2 years, and my father had resisted on principle, and partly because I was paying attention in the relentless way you do when something is new and important and yours. I kept the house. I had thought about selling it in those early weeks when everything felt like too much, but then I watered the roses and they bloomed in the spring, improbably stubborn as ever. And I thought about my father saying, "Take care of them. You're the only one who ever remembered." So I kept it. I moved in on a Saturday in March with 2 friends, a rented truck, and a very long playlist my best friend made called Starting Over, the good version. We ordered Thai food and ate it on the kitchen floor surrounded by boxes, and it was the best meal I'd had in months. I think about what my father did sometimes, the quiet advance work of it, the fact that he did not know for certain what was coming, only that something was off, only that the person he had trusted with his daughter had started to seem like someone worth watching more carefully, and instead of confronting anyone, instead of making a scene or issuing ultimatums or demanding explanations, he just made sure he pulled his careful hands through all the legal architecture of his life, and he left it in order, left it pointed in the right direction, and then he went on loving me for the time he had left without ever once making me feel like I was being protected. That, I think, is one of the truest kinds of love there is. The kind that works in advance, quietly, before you know you need it. I still talk to him sometimes, not in any organized way, not at a specific time, just when I'm out in the backyard in the early morning with coffee, when the Phoenix air is still cool for about 40 minutes before the heat settles in and the day starts in earnest, and the roses are doing what they do, which is refuse to die against all reasonable expectation. I tell him the boring things mostly. The company, the units, what Gus said this week that made me laugh. The way the climbing rose on the east fence finally reached the top rail, and I think he would have had a lot of opinions about that. And sometimes I just stand there, and the morning is quiet, and I think, he knew. Before I did. Before any of it happened. He knew, and he did what he could, and it was enough. It was more than enough. I keep thinking about the timing of things, not in a mystical way. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score in a ledger somewhere, but I do believe that how a person lives accumulates, that the choices you make quietly, when no one is watching and there's no immediate reward, add up into something real. My father understood that. He spent 40 years being the kind of man who showed up, kept his word, protected what he loved without making a production of it, and when it mattered most, when the thing he had quietly sensed was coming finally arrived, all of that accumulated decency was already in place, already working on my behalf, before I even knew I needed it. My husband made different choices. Not dramatically, not all at once. Gradually, over months, and the small decisions that seem inconsequential until they're not. He chose to betray someone who trusted him. He chose to do it during the most vulnerable stretch of my life, when I was watching my father die by inches and had nothing left over for suspicion. And then he chose to hand me papers across a table we'd bought together, 4 days after a funeral, and call it practical. What he didn't understand, what I think people who operate that way rarely understand, is that integrity isn't just a moral position. It's also a kind of intelligence. My father saw something in my husband that I had explained away, minimized, chosen not to examine too closely. My father didn't have that blind spot. He paid attention. He thought carefully about what he was seeing. And then he acted on it with patience and precision, not out of anger, but out of love. That's not luck. That's wisdom. The kind you build slowly by consistently choosing to see clearly instead of conveniently. And then there's what it took for me to keep going afterward. I won't pretend the months after the funeral were easy. There were mornings when getting dressed felt like a significant accomplishment. There were nights when I sat in a house full of my father's things and felt the specific weight of losing two people at once. The father I buried and the husband I thought I'd known. Grit isn't something you discover you have in the good stretches. You find out what you're made of when the thing you were holding on to is gone and you have to figure out what's underneath. What I found eventually was that I was more capable than I'd been living like. Running the company, learning the parts of my father's work I'd never paid attention to, sitting across from Gus and taking notes and asking questions without embarrassment. That was not the life I had planned, but it became the life I was actually living, and there was something clarifying about that. My father gave me a foundation, but the standing up was mine to do. I think about the roses sometimes as a kind of answer to all of it. Stubborn, impractical, refusing to die in a climate that doesn't really want them. My father planted them anyway, kept trying, never quite succeeded. And somehow the one time someone just paid attention and showed up consistently, they survived. That's not a miracle. That's just what happens when care is steady and real. He knew what he was leaving me. He knew I'd figure out the rest. He was right.